On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, over 200,000 German troops initiated the largest Wehrmacht offensive on the Western Front since the 1940 campaign in France. This operation, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, represented Adolf Hitler's final strategic gamble to reverse Germany's deteriorating military position. The offensive targeted an 80-kilometer front in the Ardennes forest region of Belgium and Luxembourg, defended by 4 under-strength American divisions. What followed became known as the Battle of the Bulge, a 44-day engagement that would decisively demonstrate the transformation of the United States Army from inexperienced force to formidable military power. If you appreciate meticulously researched World War II history based on primary sources and declassified military records, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from our international audience. The genesis of Operation Wacht am Rhein occurred in autumn 1944, as Germany faced simultaneous pressure from Soviet forces advancing from the east and Anglo-American armies pushing toward the Rhine from the west. According to declassified Wehrmacht planning documents, Hitler convened a strategic conference on September 16, 1944, with Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Hitler's plan called for 3 German armies to execute a rapid breakthrough in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and effectively split Allied forces in 2. The strategic logic behind this ambitious plan centered on political rather than purely military calculations. Hitler believed that a successful offensive splitting British and American armies would create diplomatic fissures in the Allied coalition, potentially forcing a separate peace with the Western powers. This would theoretically allow Germany to concentrate remaining resources against the Soviet Union. Historians have extensively debated whether this strategic assessment reflected genuine analysis or represented wishful thinking, disconnected from military realities on the ground. Wehrmacht planners allocated substantial resources to the offensive. Intelligence records indicate the Germans concentrated 12 panzer divisions, including elite Waffen-SS units, supported by 18 infantry and Volksgrenadier divisions. Equipment inventories documented approximately 600 tanks and assault guns, 19900 artillery pieces, and 800 operational Luftwaffe aircraft. Personnel strength reached approximately 200,000 combat troops, with an additional 250,000 in supporting roles. However, multiple German commanders expressed serious reservations about the operation's feasibility. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander of Oberbefehl West, characterized the plan in his post-war interrogation as fundamentally unrealistic given available resources. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, submitted alternative proposals for more limited objectives. Their concerns centered on 3 critical vulnerabilities: insufficient fuel reserves, with most mechanized units carrying supplies for only 150 kilometers of operations, overwhelming Allied air superiority, and inadequate replacement capacity for inevitable combat losses. Hitler rejected these objections. According to testimony from surviving staff officers, the Führer insisted the offensive represented Germany's sole remaining opportunity to avoid complete military collapse. Preparation proceeded under extreme security measures. The codename Wacht am Rhein deliberately suggested defensive operations to mislead Allied intelligence. Troop movements occurred exclusively during darkness. Radio communications were prohibited, except in emergencies. Officers involved in planning signed security oaths under threat of execution for disclosure. By December 15th, German forces had completed their concentration opposite the Ardennes sector. The 6th Panzer Army, under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, deployed on the northern flank. The 5th Panzer Army under General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel occupied the central sector. The 7th Army under General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger covered the southern flank. This represented the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserve in the west, everything Germany could mobilize for offensive operations. The American defensive sector targeted by the German offensive extended from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, approximately 80 kilometers of front. This sector fell under responsibility of Lieutenant General Troy H. Middleton's 8th Corps, part of Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges' 1st Army. Declassified U.S. Army records indicate Middleton commanded 4 divisions: the 106th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, and the 99th Infantry Division, with attached cavalry and engineer units. American force density in this sector averaged 1 division per 20 kilometers of front, approximately half the doctrinal recommendation for defensive operations in difficult terrain. This thinning of forces reflected command assessments that the Ardennes' dense forests, narrow road networks, and limited maneuver space made the region unsuitable for large-scale offensive operations. Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters considered the sector a quiet zone, appropriate for resting divisions recovering from heavy combat or acclimatizing newly arrived units to frontline conditions. The 106th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Alan W. Jones, had arrived in theater on December 11th, merely 5 days before the German offensive commenced. Unit records indicate this division had received only minimal combat orientation training before assuming defensive responsibilities. The division occupied positions around Sankt Vith, a critical road junction in the central Ardennes. Personnel strength stood at approximately 16,000 officers and men, but the division lacked combat experience and had not completed construction of comprehensive defensive fortifications. The 28th Infantry Division under Major General Norman D. Cotter held the central sector. This division had sustained significant casualties during the bitter fighting in the Hürtgen Forest during November 1944 and was officially in the Ardennes sector for rest and refitting. Combat strength had been restored to approximately 13,000 personnel through replacement drafts, but unit cohesion remained below optimal levels. Defensive positions were thinly held, with some companies responsible for frontages exceeding 2 kilometers. Intelligence records reveal that American commanders at Corps and Army level did not anticipate major German offensive operations in the Ardennes. Intelligence summaries from early December 1944 noted increased German activity and troop movements, but these observations were interpreted as defensive preparations or local counterattacks rather than indicators of strategic offensive intent. 1st Army Intelligence Officer Colonel Benjamin A. Dixon had actually warned of possible German offensive action in a December 10th intelligence estimate, but this assessment was not widely credited at higher headquarters. The disparity between American defensive dispositions and German offensive preparations would become starkly apparent within hours of the attack's commencement. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16, 1944, German artillery units along the 80-kilometer Ardennes front opened coordinated fire. Approximately 1,900 guns and rocket projectors delivered a 90-minute bombardment on American positions. Survivors' accounts describe the intensity of this barrage as unprecedented in their experience on the Western Front since the Normandy invasion. Trees were shattered, communication lines severed, and defensive positions subjected to sustained high explosive and fragmentation fire. The artillery preparation, while intense, consumed a significant portion of available German ammunition reserves. Wehrmacht logistics officers had calculated that extended bombardment would compromise ammunition availability for subsequent operations, leading to the decision to limit preparatory fire to 90 minutes. At 70, German infantry and armor began assault operations along the entire front. The main German effort fell on 3 axes. In the northern sector, 6th Panzer Army's primary strike force, ISS Panzer Corps, attacked toward the Elsenborn Ridge with the objective of breaking through to the Meuse River bridges between Liège and Huy. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler spearheaded this advance. Combat records indicate these divisions had been brought up to approximately 80% of authorized strength through priority allocation of personnel and equipment. In the central sector, 5th Panzer Army executed what German planning documents identified as the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the offensive. General von Manteuffel's forces attacked toward Sankt Vith and Bastogne with the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, and 116th Panzer Division leading the assault. Manteuffel had specifically ordered his units to infiltrate American positions before first light, attacking without preliminary artillery fire to achieve tactical surprise. The southern sector saw 7th Army's infantry divisions advance to create a protective shoulder for the main panzer thrusts. These Volksgrenadier divisions had been assigned to push toward the Meuse, while preventing American reinforcements from striking the flank of the main offensive. American units responded to the assault with varying degrees of effectiveness. The 99th Infantry Division on the northern shoulder, despite heavy pressure from 6th Panzer Army, maintained cohesive defensive lines throughout December 16th. The division's 395th Infantry Regiment, positioned around the town of Höfen, repelled multiple German attacks and held critical terrain that channeled subsequent German advances into more constrained avenues. However, in the central sector, the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division faced catastrophic circumstances. Two of the division's 3 regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, totaling approximately 8,000 troops, became isolated in a salient near Schnee-Eifel when German forces penetrated their flanks. Communication with division headquarters was severed by mid-morning. These regiments would spend the next 3 days encircled, with dwindling ammunition and no prospect of relief or withdrawal. The German advance achieved significant penetrations by nightfall on December 16th. In the 5th Panzer Army sector, armored spearheads had advanced 20 kilometers in some areas. American command and control had been severely disrupted. Telephone networks were destroyed. Radio communications proved unreliable in the heavily forested terrain, and the speed of German penetrations left many American units isolated without current intelligence on the tactical situation. Among the German armored spearheads, one unit achieved particular notoriety and posed the greatest potential threat to American positions, Kampfgruppe Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division. This battle group, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, consisted of approximately 5,000 troops, equipped with tanks, half-tracks, and self-propelled artillery. Piper's mission assigned him the lead role in 6th Panzer Army's drive toward the Meuse River crossings. Piper's route of advance took his forces through the towns of Honsfeld, Büllingen, and Malmedy, before turning west toward Stavelot and the Amblev River Valley. Combat records indicate that on December 17th, Kampfgruppe Piper advanced approximately 25 kilometers, seizing fuel dumps at Büllingen that partially alleviated the battle group's growing supply problems. Near the crossroads at Bastogne, south of Malmedy, elements of Kampfgruppe Piper encountered Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a lightly armed American service unit. After a brief engagement, approximately 84 American soldiers surrendered. What occurred next became one of the war's most documented atrocities. SS troops executed the American prisoners in an adjacent field. This event, known as the Malmedy Massacre, became emblematic of the brutality characterizing portions of the Ardennes battle and significantly hardened American soldiers' attitudes toward SS formations. Piper's advance continued westward, reaching Stavelot on December 18th. Here, the German battle group confronted its first significant obstacle. American engineer units, following standing orders to demolish bridges threatened by enemy advance, had prepared demolitions on crossings over the Amblev River. When Kampfgruppe Piper approached, these bridges were destroyed, forcing Piper to seek alternative routes. American reinforcements were converging on the penetration zone. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran unit with extensive combat experience, deployed to contain Piper's advance. Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, originally slated for rest after Operation Market Garden in September, received emergency orders to move to the northern shoulder of the German penetration. These units would prove instrumental in containing 6th Panzer Army's advance. By December 19th, Kampfgruppe Piper had reached the town of Stoumont, approximately 10 kilometers from a major American fuel depot at Sprimont. However, Piper's situation was deteriorating rapidly. American forces controlled the roads behind him, severing his supply lines. Fuel and ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Radio communication with parent headquarters became intermittent. American artillery and tank destroyer units established blocking positions west of Stoumont, preventing further advance toward the Meuse. Piper's war diary entries from this period, recovered after the war, document his recognition that the battle group had become isolated with no prospect of relief or resupply. On December 22nd, after fighting off multiple American counterattacks, Piper received authorization to withdraw. However, his armored vehicles lacked sufficient fuel for movement. Piper made the decision to destroy his heavy equipment and withdraw his personnel on foot through American lines. Of the approximately 5,000 men who began the offensive, approximately 800 successfully returned to German lines by December 24th. The failure of Kampfgruppe Piper exemplified the fundamental problems afflicting the German offensive: inadequate fuel supplies, overwhelming American artillery superiority once reinforcements arrived, and the inability of German forces to maintain momentum against reorganizing American defenses. The most complete American tactical defeat during the opening phase of the Ardennes offensive occurred in the 106th Infantry Division's sector, around Sankt Vith. As previously noted, two regiments of this division, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, became encircled on December 16th, when German forces penetrated their flanks from the Schnee-Eifel salient. Military historians have extensively analyzed the decisions that led to this encirclement. Division Commander Major General Alan W. Jones received initial reports of German attacks on his flanks at approximately 8 guards on December 16th. However, the extent and seriousness of the German offensive was not immediately apparent. Jones' first inclination was to order his forward regiments to hold their positions while he attempted to organize counterattacks to restore the situation. By December 17th, the tactical reality had become clearer. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry regiments were isolated, surrounded by elements of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division and the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division. German forces controlled all roads leading to the encircled positions. Attempts to supply the surrounded troops by air proved ineffective due to weather conditions and German anti-aircraft fire. Colonel George L. Deschanel, Jr., commanding the 422nd Infantry Regiment, and Colonel Charles C. Cavender, commanding the 423rd Infantry Regiment, attempted to organize breakout operations. However, their units lacked adequate maps of the area, possessed minimal ammunition reserves, and had no armored support. Combat reports indicate that American soldiers in the pocket were enduring temperatures below freezing with inadequate winter clothing and diminishing food supplies. General Jones directed the 7th Armored Division, commanded by Brigadier General Robert W. Hasbrouck, to advance to Sankt Vith and attempt relief of the encircled regiments. However, the 7th Armored Division was dispersed across a wide area when it received movement orders and required substantial time to concentrate. Additionally, German forces advancing towards Sankt Vith forced Hasbrouck to establish defensive positions around the town rather than pushing east toward the isolated regiments. On December 19th, after 3 days of encirclement without relief or resupply, Colonels Deschanel and Cavender made the decision to surrender their commands. Approximately 7,000 American soldiers entered German captivity, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in the European theater of operations. This capitulation was exploited extensively by German propaganda to boost morale among Wehrmacht troops. However, the 106th Infantry Division's sacrifice was not without strategic value. The encircled regiments tied down substantial German forces for 3 critical days, forces that might otherwise have exploited the breakthrough toward the Meuse River. Additionally, the defense of Sankt Vith by the 7th Armored Division and remnants of the 106th Infantry Division delayed German timetables by nearly a week, providing crucial time for American reinforcements to move into theater. While fighting raged across the Ardennes front, one location acquired particular operational significance: the Belgian town of Bastogne. This market town sat at the intersection of 7 major roads, making it a critical transportation hub for military operations in the region. German operational plans required capture of Bastogne to facilitate movement of supplies and reinforcements to armored spearheads advancing toward the Meuse. On December 18th, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force ordered the 101st Airborne Division, then resting near Reims, France, to move immediately to Bastogne. The division, commanded by Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, who was absent in the United States, deployed under temporary command of Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe, the division artillery commander. The 101st had earned a formidable combat reputation during airborne operations in Normandy and Operation Market Garden. The division executed a rapid road march of approximately 170 kilometers in adverse winter conditions, arriving in Bastogne on the evening of December 18th. McAuliffe immediately established a perimeter defense around the town, incorporating remnants of armored and engineer units already in the area. Total American strength in Bastogne reached approximately 18,000 troops, but the force lacked adequate artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and cold weather equipment. German forces encircled Bastogne by December 21st. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division bypassed the town to the north, while the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and Panzer Lehr Division conducted siege operations. German artillery subjected the town to sustained bombardment. Luftwaffe aircraft conducted nighttime harassment raids. American casualties mounted, but the lack of German ground assault suggested that Wehrmacht commanders were reluctant to expend troops in costly urban combat. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to the American forces in Bastogne. The message, delivered under flag of truce, cited the impossibility of relief and called for honorable surrender to avoid unnecessary casualties. McAuliffe's response became one of the war's most famous, "nuts." This single-word reply was delivered to the German emissaries, who required explanation of the American idiom's meaning. The siege of Bastogne created significant problems for German operational planning. 5th Panzer Army's armored spearheads advancing west of Bastogne required supplies and reinforcements routed through the town's road network. The American garrison's continued resistance disrupted German logistics and forced commitment of forces needed elsewhere. By December 23rd, German commanders recognized that Bastogne must be captured, leading to intensified assault operations. However, December 23rd also brought a crucial change in weather conditions. Thick fog and low clouds that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week lifted, allowing full-scale air operations. Transport aircraft dropped supplies to Bastogne's defenders, ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Fighter bombers attacked German forces surrounding the perimeter. The psychological impact on both American defenders and German attackers was substantial. Simultaneously, relief operations were advancing from the south. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army, executing a rapid reorientation of its offensive axis, was driving north toward Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading this advance, made contact with the 101st Airborne Division's perimeter on December 26th, breaking the siege. Casualties during the Bastogne operation had been significant. The 101st Airborne Division reported approximately 2,000 casualties, but the town's successful defense represented a major operational achievement. The American response to the German Ardennes offensive required rapid redeployment of substantial forces. The most impressive example of this occurred with Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr.'s Third Army, which executed a 90-degree pivot of its operational axis in approximately 72 hours. A maneuver military historians regard as exceptional in modern warfare. On December 19th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, convened a conference at Verdun with senior American commanders. The meeting's purpose was to coordinate Allied response to the German offensive. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly Third Army could attack northward into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton's response, that he could attack within 48 hours, initially met skepticism from other commanders present. However, Patton had already begun preliminary planning. Third Army staff officers had developed contingency plans for northward redeployment beginning on December 18th before receiving formal orders. This foresight allowed Patton to expedite execution once authorization was received. The logistical challenge was substantial. Third Army consisted of approximately 133,000 combat troops organized in 3 corps, plus approximately 15,000 vehicles ranging from tanks to supply trucks. Chief of Staff Major General Hobart R. Gay orchestrated the movement plan. 3 divisions would lead the redeployment: the 4th Armored Division toward Ardennes, the 26th Infantry Division toward Luxembourg, and the 80th Infantry Division toward Mersch. Supporting units would follow in phased sequence. Each division received specific march routes, with military police controlling traffic and engineers maintaining roads in winter conditions. Security required that German reconnaissance not detect the redeployment. Movement occurred primarily during darkness, with units concealing themselves in forests during daylight. Radio silence was enforced, except for emergency communications. French civilian authorities assisted by providing billeting and fuel from local depots. Army Air Forces transport provided aerial resupply where ground transportation proved inadequate. By December 22nd, precisely on Patton's promised timeline, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached Ardennes, approximately 30 kilometers south of Bastogne. The 26th Infantry Division occupied positions near Luxembourg City, and the 80th Infantry Division had assembled near Mersch. This represented movement of an entire army, 3 corps comprising 9 divisions, a distance of approximately 150 kilometers in winter conditions, while maintaining operational security and arriving combat-ready. German intelligence had failed to detect Third Army's redeployment until American forces actually commenced attack operations. This intelligence failure reflected broader problems in Wehrmacht reconnaissance capabilities by late 1944. Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance had been severely degraded by Allied air superiority, and ground reconnaissance lacked the mobility to effectively monitor distant areas. When American forces attacked from the south on December 22nd, German commanders were operationally and tactically surprised by the force and direction of the assault. At 6 on the morning of December 22, 1944, Third Army initiated its counter-offensive into the southern shoulder of the German Ardennes penetration. The attack's primary objective was relief of the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, but broader operational goals included severing German supply lines and threatening the flank of Wehrmacht forces advancing westward. Major General Hugh J. Gaffey's 4th Armored Division led the assault. This formation, one of the U.S. Army's most experienced armored divisions, deployed in a traditional assault configuration with Combat Command A and Combat Command B advancing on parallel axes toward Bastogne, while Combat Command Reserve followed as exploitation force. Supporting artillery included both divisional organic battalions and attached corps artillery units, providing substantial fire support. German defensive positions in the Third Army's path were held by elements of the 5th Parachute Division and the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, formations that had been assigned to create a defensive shoulder for 5th Panzer Army's main thrust. These units occupied prepared positions in the villages and rolling terrain south of Bastogne. Wehrmacht commanders had not anticipated a major American counteroffensive from this direction, and defensive preparations were incomplete. Initial contact occurred at the town of Martelange, where German parachute infantry had established defensive positions. Rather than conducting a direct frontal assault, American armor employed flanking maneuvers, with small tank infantry teams infiltrating around German strongpoints. Self-propelled artillery provided direct fire support. Within several hours, Martelange was secured with casualties described in after-action reports as relatively light compared to the results achieved. Progress toward Bastogne encountered increasingly determined resistance as German commanders recognized the threat. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and additional Volksgrenadier units were committed to block Third Army's advance. Fighting intensified around the villages of Chaumont, Bigonville, and Assenois. American forces employed combined arms tactics with armor, infantry, artillery, and air support closely coordinated to overcome German defensive positions. Weather conditions on December 23rd shifted decisively in American favor. Clear skies allowed tactical air support to operate at maximum effectiveness. Fighter bombers from Nye's Tactical Air Command attacked German positions, supply columns, and reserves moving toward the combat zone. Medium bombers struck transportation choke points and fuel depots. The psychological impact on German troops, who had become accustomed to Luftwaffe absence, was substantial, according to prisoner interrogations. The final approach to Bastogne required breaching German siege lines. On December 26th, elements of Combat Command Reserve, 4th Armored Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Crichton W. Abrams, penetrated the German perimeter near Ardennes. Coordination with 101st Airborne Division defenders allowed establishment of a corridor into Bastogne. By evening, 3rd Army had established ground contact with the garrison, effectively ending the siege. Casualties during 3rd Army's relief operation reflected the intensity of combat. The 4th Armored Division reported approximately 1,400 casualties between December 22nd and December 26th. German losses in the same sector exceeded 5,000 killed, wounded, and captured, according to U.S. Army estimates based on prisoner interrogations and battlefield surveys. Additionally, substantial German equipment was destroyed or abandoned, particularly vehicles immobilized by fuel shortages. The clearing weather on December 23rd enabled full deployment of Allied air power, a factor that fundamentally altered the operational situation in the Ardennes. For the initial week of the German offensive, persistent fog, low clouds, and snow had effectively grounded Allied aircraft, while German forces conducted ground operations with minimal air interdiction. The weather change coincided with 3rd Army's counter-offensive and American defensive consolidation along the northern shoulder, creating optimal conditions for coordinated air-ground operations. Allied air forces committed to the Ardennes battle included the U.S. 9th Air Force, the U.S. 8th Air Force, and Royal Air Force units. The 9th Air Force's 9 Tactical Air Command, commanded by Major General Elwood R. P. Pete Quesada, provided close air support and battlefield interdiction. The 8th Air Force's heavy bomber groups struck German transportation infrastructure, fuel production facilities, and staging areas in rear areas. RAF squadrons supplemented American efforts, particularly in armed reconnaissance missions. Fighter-bomber operations achieved immediate tactical results. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, armed with bombs, rockets, and 50 caliber machine guns, attacked German armored columns that stood exposed on snow-covered terrain with limited concealment. Pilot after-action reports documented destruction of tanks, self-propelled guns, trucks, and horse-drawn transport. German armored formations, which had advanced with minimal air opposition for a week, suddenly faced constant aerial attack during daylight hours. Strategic bombing operations targeted German logistics networks. Heavy bombers struck marshalling yards at Koblenz, Trier, and other critical rail junctions supporting German forces in the Ardennes. Bridges over the Rhine River received sustained attention, disrupting movement of reinforcements and supplies from Germany proper. Fuel production and storage facilities were priority targets, given German forces' critical fuel shortages. Transport aircraft provided essential support to isolated American units. Most dramatically, C-47 Skytrain aircraft of the 9E Troop Carrier Command conducted supply drops to the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, delivering ammunition, medical supplies, food, and cold weather equipment. Weather conditions and German anti-aircraft fire made these missions hazardous, but the supplies delivered were essential to the garrison's continued resistance. Similar supply operations supported other American units in forward positions. German Luftwaffe response proved inadequate. The German Air Force committed approximately 800 aircraft to support the Ardennes offensive, but faced overwhelming numerical inferiority against Allied forces that could deploy over 4,000 aircraft. Luftwaffe pilot quality had deteriorated significantly by late 1944 due to training cutbacks and fuel shortages. Allied fighter pilots with extensive combat experience consistently dominated aerial engagements. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massed attack on Allied airfields, but losses sustained rendered the German Air Force combat ineffective for the remainder of the battle. Air superiority's impact extended beyond direct destruction of German forces. Constant aerial observation provided intelligence on German movements and concentrations. Interdiction of supply routes created logistics crises for Wehrmacht units. The inability to operate freely during daylight restricted German tactical options. Prisoner interrogations consistently revealed that Allied air power had significant psychological effects on German soldiers' morale and confidence. By December 24th, German offensive momentum had effectively ceased. The high watermark of the advance occurred on December 24th to 25th when the 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements reached Cheles, approximately 5 kilometers from the Meuse River. However, this represented the absolute limit of German logistical capacity. The division's combat units lacked fuel to continue operations and faced encirclement by converging American forces. Multiple factors contributed to the offensive's culmination. Fuel shortages, which German planners had anticipated but hoped to mitigate by capturing American supplies, proved insurmountable. The rapid American response prevented large-scale capture of fuel stocks. What supplies existed were consumed rapidly by mechanized units conducting offensive operations. By December 24th, most German panzer divisions reported fuel supplies sufficient for less than 50 kilometers of movement, inadequate for reaching operational objectives. American defensive actions at critical points disrupted German operational plans. The successful defense of Sankt Vith until December 21st delayed 5th Panzer Army's advance by approximately 1 week. The continued resistance at Bastogne blocked vital road networks and forced commitment of forces to siege operations rather than exploitation. The stalwart defense by the 2nd Infantry Division and 99th Infantry Division on the northern shoulder prevented 6th Panzer Army from achieving its breakthrough objectives. German casualties had become unsustainable. Wehrmacht forces in the Ardennes had suffered approximately 30,000 casualties by December 24th, killed, wounded, and missing. Replacement capacity was inadequate to restore unit combat effectiveness. Equipment losses, particularly tanks and self-propelled artillery, could not be replaced from German production, which prioritized Eastern Front requirements. Ammunition expenditure rates exceeded resupply capabilities, limiting German artillery effectiveness. Allied reinforcements, conversely, continued flowing into the Ardennes theater. Beyond Third Army's redeployment, additional divisions moved from other sectors. The British XXX Corps deployed to the Meuse River as a strategic reserve, though ultimately was not committed to combat. American divisions from 9th Army repositioned to the northern shoulder. Schaeff theater reserves, including armored and airborne divisions, became available as operational reserve. The force ratio, which had briefly favored Germany at the offensive's commencement, now decisively favored the Allies. On December 26th, Adolf Hitler convened a conference at his headquarters in Siegenberg to assess the offensive's status. Generals von Rundstedt and Model presented unvarnished assessments. The operation had failed to achieve objectives, forces were overextended and vulnerable, and withdrawal was militarily necessary. However, Hitler refused authorization for general withdrawal, instead ordering continued offensive operations on a reduced scale. This decision trapped German forces in an exposed salient subject to attack from 3 directions. With German offensive capability exhausted, Allied commanders planned operations to eliminate the Ardennes Bulge and destroy Wehrmacht forces remaining in the salient. The operational concept called for coordinated attacks from north and south to meet in the center, encircling German forces and preventing orderly withdrawal. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army would attack from the north, while Lieutenant General George Patton's 3rd Army continued pressure from the south. 1st Army's attack commenced January 3rd, with 3 corps attacking southward. 7 Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins struck toward Houffalize. 16-8 Airborne Corps under Major General Matthew B. Ridgway advanced from the northern shoulder. V Corps held defensive positions on the eastern flank. Supporting these operations were approximately 250,000 combat troops, substantially greater strength than American forces available when the German offensive began. 3rd Army intensified operations from the south. Beteet, Corps under Major General Troy Middleton, reinforced with additional divisions, attacked northward toward Houffalize to link with 1st Army. The Thie, Corps under Major General John Milliken conducted offensive operations towards Sankt Vith. Tutin Corps under Major General Manton Eddy maintained pressure on the eastern face of the salient. Patton's forces now numbered approximately 180,000 combat troops, organized in 9 divisions. German forces attempted to conduct an organized withdrawal while maintaining defensive positions. However, coordination proved difficult. Communication networks had been severely damaged. Supply routes were interdicted by Allied air attacks. Unit cohesion deteriorated as casualties mounted, and soldiers' confidence in ultimate success evaporated. Many formations retreated as fragmented groups rather than organized units. Weather conditions alternated between clear and overcast, but even limited periods of clear weather allowed Allied air operations that severely punished retreating German columns. Tactical aircraft attacked road networks, destroying vehicles and creating congestion. Artillery, benefiting from improved weather for aerial observation, delivered sustained fire on German positions and movement routes. American and British artillery ammunition expenditure during January 1945 exceeded any previous month of the war in Northwest Europe. American forces encountered varying levels of German resistance. Some Volksgrenadier divisions maintained cohesive defensive positions and withdrew in good order. Other units fragmented, with substantial numbers of soldiers surrendering rather than continuing futile resistance. SS formations, despite heavy losses, generally maintained higher combat effectiveness than regular Wehrmacht units. However, all German formations suffered from inadequate supplies, particularly fuel and ammunition. The link-up between First Army and Third Army occurred at Houffalize on January 16th, effectively closing the Bulge. German forces west of this line had largely withdrawn, though substantial equipment was abandoned due to fuel shortages. American forces now held positions approximately equivalent to the front lines on December 16th, when the German offensive began. Can-U German forces retreated to the Siegfried Line fortifications along the German border. Assessing precise casualties for the Battle of the Bulge presents challenges due to variations in reporting methods and definitions used by different armies. However, official U.S. Army records compiled after the war provide reasonably reliable statistics for American forces, while German losses must be estimated from various sources including prisoner interrogations, intelligence assessments, and post-war German military records. U.S. Army casualties during the period December 16, 1944 through January 25, 1945 totaled approximately 89,000 personnel. This figure included approximately 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured. The missing category primarily comprised the 106th Infantry Division regiments captured at Schnee-Eifel, plus smaller groups isolated and captured elsewhere. Casualty rates varied significantly among formations. Divisions engaged in sustained defensive combat, or isolated positions, suffered disproportionately compared to units that arrived as reinforcements after German offensive momentum had ceased. German casualties are estimated at approximately 67,000 to 100,000 personnel, though sources differ on precise figures. The lower estimates derive from Wehrmacht records that survived the war, while higher estimates incorporate prisoner interrogations and Allied intelligence assessments. German losses included approximately 15,000 to 18,000 killed, with the remainder wounded or captured. Notably, German casualty figures exclude substantial numbers of soldiers captured during January 1945, as the Allies eliminated the Bulge. When these prisoners are included, total German personnel losses exceed 100,000. Equipment losses reflected the battle's intensity. American forces lost approximately 733 tanks and tank destroyers, plus several hundred other armored vehicles. Artillery pieces lost totaled approximately 185 guns. Vehicle losses, including trucks and jeeps, exceeded 1,000. These losses, while substantial, were replaced within weeks from American production and existing stocks in the European theater of operations. German equipment losses were catastrophic in context of Germany's industrial situation. Wehrmacht forces lost between 600 and 800 tanks and assault guns, roughly equivalent to total German armored vehicle production for 2 months. Self-propelled artillery, towed guns, and other heavy equipment losses exceeded 600 pieces. Vehicle losses, including trucks and horse-drawn transport, numbered in the thousands. Unlike American losses, German equipment could not be rapidly replaced. German tank production prioritized the Eastern Front, and transportation limitations prevented efficient distribution of available equipment. Luftwaffe losses during the Ardennes operations, and particularly during Operation Bodenplatte, on January 1, 1945, exceeded 800 aircraft. These losses included both aircraft destroyed and irreplaceable pilots killed or captured. By contrast, Allied air forces, despite sustaining losses from German anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, maintained numerical superiority and operational effectiveness throughout. The battle's material costs for Germany proved strategically decisive. The Wehrmacht had committed its last strategic reserve in the West and suffered losses that could not be replaced. Following the Ardennes offensive, German forces in the West lacked capacity for significant offensive operations and could conduct only defensive operations of declining effectiveness. The path to the Rhine River and subsequently into Germany proper lay open to Allied armies. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the transformation of the United States Army from the relatively inexperienced force that landed in North Africa in 1942 to a mature, professional military organization capable of recovering from initial surprise and executing complex offensive operations. Military historians have extensively analyzed factors contributing to American operational success. American advantages included superior logistics infrastructure. The U.S. Army's extensive motor transport capacity enabled rapid redeployment of divisions across considerable distances while maintaining combat effectiveness. By contrast, German forces relied substantially on rail transport, vulnerable to Allied air interdiction, and horse-drawn transport, slow and limited capacity. American supply systems ensured that units engaged in combat received continuous resupply of ammunition, fuel, and equipment replacements. German units frequently operated at the limits of their supply lines. Communication systems provided Americans with operational advantages. Radio equipment, including the SCR-300 walkie-talkie at company level and vehicle-mounted radios in armored formations, allowed flexible command and control even when units were dispersed or situations fluid. German communications depended more heavily on wire systems vulnerable to artillery fire and combat damage. When German formations became dispersed or isolated, commanders often lost effective control. American combined arms integration reached high levels of effectiveness by late 1944. Infantry, armor, artillery, and tactical air support operated in coordinated fashion at division level and below. Forward air controllers accompanied ground units and could request close air support rapidly. Artillery forward observers coordinated fires from multiple battalions on critical targets. This integration allowed American forces to concentrate overwhelming combat power at decisive points. Adaptability and initiative among American officers and soldiers proved crucial during the battle's chaotic initial phase. When command structures were disrupted and communications severed, junior officers and NCOs made decisions, organized ad hoc defensive positions, and conducted local counterattacks without waiting for higher headquarters guidance. This contrasted with German military culture that, despite doctrinal emphasis on initiative, often left junior leaders paralyzed when separated from higher command. American commanders demonstrated operational flexibility. The most dramatic example was Patton's Third Army redeployment, but flexibility extended throughout the command structure. Eisenhower rapidly shifted divisions between armies as situations required. Corps and division commanders adapted plans based on evolving circumstances. This flexibility reflected both doctrinal emphasis on decentralized execution and cultural factors that encouraged innovation rather than rigid adherence to plans. However, American performance was not without deficiencies. Intelligence failures prior to December 16th allowed German offensive preparations without detection. Some units, particularly inexperienced formations like the 106th Infantry Division, performed poorly under sudden pressure. Coordination between First Army and Third Army remained imperfect, allowing some German forces to withdraw when more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed additional formations. Operation Wacht am Rhein represented one of modern military history's most dramatic examples of strategic overreach. German planning proceeded from flawed assumptions about American military capabilities, Allied political unity, and Germany's own logistical capacity. Analysis of these failures provides insights into Wehrmacht performance in the war's final phase. The fundamental strategic error was Hitler's assessment that splitting Allied armies would create political fissures sufficient to enable a separate peace with the Western Allies. This assessment had no basis in reality by late 1944. The Casablanca Conference's unconditional surrender policy, reiterated at multiple subsequent Allied conferences, reflected genuine consensus among American and British leaderships that Nazi Germany must be completely defeated. No operational setback, however dramatic, would alter this fundamental policy. Operational planning suffered from excessive optimism regarding fuel supplies. German planners calculated that captured American fuel dumps would supplement initial supplies, allowing panzer divisions to reach operational objectives. This assumption proved invalid. American forces either destroyed fuel dumps or successfully defended them. Even had substantial fuel stocks been captured, distribution to forward units through damaged road networks under Allied air attack would have posed insurmountable challenges. Logistical preparations were inadequate for the operation's scope. Artillery ammunition stocks, while sufficient for initial bombardment, proved insufficient for sustained operations. Food supplies for troops and fodder for horses, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horse transport, were minimal. Medical services lacked capacity to handle anticipated casualties. These deficiencies reflected Germany's broader resource exhaustion by late 1944, but proceeding with the offensive despite known shortages constituted command negligence. Tactical execution revealed Wehrmacht performance degradation from earlier war years. Tank crews, while individually courageous, often lacked the tactical proficiency that characterized panzer forces in 1939-1942. Infantry formations varied widely in quality, with Volksgrenadier divisions often poorly trained and inadequately equipped. Coordination between different formations frequently broke down. These problems reflected personnel quality decline, as experienced soldiers were casualties and replacements received abbreviated training. German intelligence regarding American forces proved fundamentally flawed. Wehrmacht assessments underestimated American resilience, flexibility, and capacity for rapid operational response. The assumption that American units would collapse under pressure, as French forces had in 1940, ignored 2 years of American combat experience in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. This intelligence failure derived partially from institutional bias. Many German officers retained prejudices about American military capability rooted in World War I experience and Nazi racial ideology. The decision to continue offensive operations after December 24th, when operational failure was apparent, compounded losses unnecessarily. A decision to conduct an organized withdrawal on December 26th or 27th would have preserved substantial forces and equipment. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal until January 8th reflected the Führer's characteristic unwillingness to acknowledge military reality. German forces that might have reinforced defenses along the Rhine River were instead destroyed in the Ardennes salient. The Ardennes offensive's failure produced strategic consequences extending far beyond immediate tactical results. Germany's last operational reserves in the West had been committed and largely destroyed, fundamentally altering the campaign's subsequent course and abbreviating the European war's duration. Immediate consequences included German defensive capability deterioration along the entire Western Front. Following the Ardennes battle, Wehrmacht forces lacked reserves to counter Allied offensives. When American and British forces launched operations toward the Rhine River in February 1945, German resistance, while often determined, could not prevent Allied breakthrough and rapid advance. The Rhine crossings at Remagen and elsewhere proceeded more easily than would have been possible had Wehrmacht reserves not been consumed in the Ardennes. Allied offensive planning accelerated following the Ardennes victory. The successful defense had demonstrated American military maturity, convincing Allied commanders that rapid advance into Germany proper was feasible. Operations Veritable and Grenade cleared the west bank of the Rhine. Subsequent Rhine crossings in March 1945 encountered resistance, but achieved objectives more rapidly than cautious planners had anticipated. By April, Allied armies were advancing into central Germany against increasingly disorganized German resistance. The Battle of the Bulge affected Allied occupation planning. The demonstration of Wehrmacht resilience in December 1944, despite Germany's desperate strategic situation, reinforced Allied determination to impose unconditional surrender and complete occupation of Germany. Plans for occupation zones and post-war administration proceeded with the assumption that Nazi Germany must be thoroughly defeated and restructured. Any negotiated settlement was rejected categorically. The battle influenced American public opinion significantly. Initial news reports of German gains and American casualties created concern among the U.S. home front. However, subsequent news of American recovery and successful counteroffensive generated renewed confidence in Allied victory. The American performance validated the strategy of deploying overwhelming force to ensure decisive victory rather than accepting protracted conflict or negotiated settlement. Personnel and equipment losses, while substantial, proved sustainable for American forces. Replacement troops from the United States maintained unit strengths. Equipment losses were rapidly replaced from production and existing stocks. By contrast, German losses in personnel and materiel could not be replaced, accelerating Wehrmacht effectiveness decline in the war's final months. The casualty exchange ratio in the Ardennes, roughly 1.5 German casualties for each American casualty, was strategically favorable to the Allies given relative manpower and industrial capacities. The Ardennes battle's psychological impact affected both military forces and civilian populations. German soldiers and civilians recognized that the offensive's failure meant Germany had exhausted options for avoiding defeat. While combat continued for 4 additional months, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied soldiers, having survived and overcome Germany's strongest remaining blow, gained confidence that victory was inevitable and achievable through continued offensive action. The Battle of the Bulge concluded on January 25, 1945, when Allied forces completed elimination of the Ardennes Bulge and restored front lines to positions held before December 16th. In 44 days of combat, the United States Army had demonstrated strategic resilience, operational flexibility, and tactical proficiency against the Wehrmacht's final major offensive in the West. The battle validated the transformation of the U.S. Army from inexperienced force to professional military organization capable of meeting elite German formations on equal or superior terms. The rapid redeployment of Third Army under General Patton, the stalwart defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division, and the effective employment of Allied air superiority exemplified American military capability by war's end. For Germany, Operation Wacht am Rhein represented strategic bankruptcy. The expenditure of irreplaceable resources, divisions, tanks, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel on an operation with minimal probability of strategic success reflected the Nazi regime's detachment from military reality. The offensive's failure opened Germany to invasion and occupation, events that followed with increasing rapidity through spring 1945. The Battle of the Bulge remains studied in military education institutions worldwide as an example of operational-level warfare, crisis response, and the integration of combat arms. The lessons identified, the importance of intelligence, the value of rapid response to enemy action, the necessity of logistical preparation, and the decisiveness of air superiority, continue to inform military planning 8 decades later. If you found this detailed examination of the Battle of the Bulge informative, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more evidence-based World War II history, and comment with your thoughts or questions. Thank you for watching.